Welcome back, everyone, and in this video we're going to talk a little bit about the aftermath of the First Crusade that was the subject of the last lecture video. After the First Crusaders have been successful in capturing the city of Jerusalem and carving out a territory for the Crusaders around the Holy City, they establish in this territory a political system, and it becomes known as the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. And so these people are known as Latins because they come from the West. And so you have these Westerners who have established this kingdom in a land where they are a minority. So it's a pretty fascinating kingdom because the ruling class is a minority, not only in terms of ethnicity, but also in some ways in terms of religion. And so there are significant Muslim populations in this kingdom, significant Greek Christians in this kingdom who are now separated, at least in some ways, from the Latin Christians after the Great Schism that we talked about in the last video. And there's also a significant Jewish population. And so it's in this circumstance that the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem is formed. And what's really interesting is that we find that the Crusaders who are living in Palestine, in the Holy Land, start to take on a lot of the cultural practices of the Middle East. They start to dress like people from the Middle East. They start to eat and follow a Middle Eastern diet. They learn Arabic. At the same time as they retain their Latin Christian identity and religious practices. They're also successful in establishing a kingdom where all these religious groups are able to live together in relative peace. They're living side by side, but they're still allowed to be governed by their own religious laws. So there's a Muslim law court and a Jewish law court. And if you want to appeal a decision beyond those law courts to the Latin Crusader rulers of the kingdom, you can, but otherwise those cases were judged within the distinct religious culture of that particular group within this kingdom. So the Latin Kingdom in Jerusalem is pretty interesting as an example of a very successful multicultural medieval kingdom. Now we have to ask how it was that the First Crusade was able to be successful. People at the time said that this was a miracle. We're in a history class, so we're not examining miracles, or we can't use a miracle as a reason for a historical event. But we need to look at some of the reasons why it was possible for a relatively small force to march such a long way through enemy territory and in the end to be successful. Big part of the reason for this that often gets overlooked is the division and infighting within the Muslim world at this time. And so remember that I talked about how you have this division that emerges in Islam between Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims. And remember how I also said that after the Abbasids become the caliphs, we establish a new dynasty, the Abbasid dynasty. They establish their capital in Baghdad, and Baghdad becomes an amazing city. But it also reflects that the Muslim world is more and more focused on Western and Central Asia and the Middle East than they are on the Mediterranean world. And so what we start to see is that while the Abbasid caliphs remain extremely rich, and while they also remain important sources of religious authority within the Muslim world, we start to see that areas that are ruled by Muslims around the Mediterranean start to break away from the Abbasids' political authority. So we start to see separate groups of Shiite Muslims come to power and start ruling separate Muslim states in Morocco, Algeria, and most significantly in Egypt, which was a large, wealthy area that was very close to Jerusalem. And so there's this division between Sunni and Shia Muslims that is becoming more pronounced in the Muslim world. Along with this, we have the arrival of the Turkic peoples in the Middle East. So these were nomadic peoples who were coming out of Central Asia, very mobile warriors who the Abbasids initially hired as mercenaries to help fight for them. And then the Turks kind of start to go into business on their own account. And they start to move into the Middle East, and they start to carve out territories for themselves in Syria and in modern-day Turkey. This is really important because there's not only now a division between Sunni and Shia Muslims, there's also a division between Turkic Muslims, because as the Turks move into these regions, they start to convert to Islam. There's also a division between Turkish Muslims and Arab Muslims who had been living in these lands before. And all these different groups really hate each other. And at the time of the First Crusade, they would rather see their opponents getting kicked in the teeth, even if it's by Christians, than they would to unite with them against the Christians, against the Crusaders. However, once this changes, once you have a situation in which you have a Muslim leader who can unify the overwhelming Muslim population of the Middle East, it's going to be very difficult for the Crusaders to maintain their kingdom. And we're going to see that this is what happens as we get into the 12th century. So by about 50 years after the First Crusade, a new Muslim leader has emerged by the name of Zengi. And Zengi and his descendants, Nuruddin, are going to be able to unite some of the regions of northern Syria against the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem. So much so that in 1146 they capture one of the major cities of this kingdom. And this provokes a reaction from Christians in Europe. They put together another crusade, a second crusade, an even bigger army to send to the help of the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem and to fight against Zengi and Nuruddin. However, this crusade, the Second Crusade, is poorly managed and poorly led and ends up being defeated and actually making the situation in the Crusader kingdom worse rather than better. So much so that by 1187, so another 40 years later, Nuruddin's successor Saladin, who's very famous, has been able to recapture Jerusalem for this new Muslim dynasty that's called the Ayubid Dynasty. And so the capture of Jerusalem, this, as you can imagine, sends shockwaves through medieval Europe. And another crusade is called. This crusade is known as the Third Crusade, and it's made famous through the participation of Richard the Lionheart of England. And Richard is one of the few generals who is able to defeat Saladin in battle. However, he does not have the resources to recapture Jerusalem, and in the end, he has to make a treaty with Saladin. The Crusaders will keep a strip of territory along the coast of Palestine, and they'll be allowed to make pilgrimages in peace to Jerusalem, but Jerusalem will remain in the hands of the Ayubid dynasty, these new Muslim rulers. As we get into the 13th century, we're going to see a further 3 or 4 major crusades. The most famous of these is the Fourth Crusade. This is famous for all the wrong reasons because it goes badly wrong, and it ends up capturing the city of Constantinople from the Byzantines, and the Crusaders sack the city in a really brutal sack. I said that the First Crusade, when it captures and sacks the city of Jerusalem, that's typically been overstated in popular sources. The Crusader sack in the Fourth Crusade of the city of Constantinople, another Christian city, has generally not been overstated. It was pretty bad. Lots of people died, lots of buildings were destroyed, lots of plunder was stolen. And this crusade is also, however, the victim of a lot of misconceptions. And so there's been a sense in which people have looked at this and have said this was kind of the plan of the Crusaders all along. This kind of shows that the Crusades from the beginning were aimed at achieving plunder rather than pursuing religious goals. This is, as I say, a misconception and a misunderstanding of the history of this crusade. When you look at this crusade in more detail, when you look at the history of this crusade, you can see that the sack of Constantinople, the fact that the city of Constantinople ends up getting sacked, this is because the crusade has gone wrong. This is because multiple plans of different leaders have gone astray. So it's certainly not accurate to say that this was the intention of this crusade from the beginning. So by the time we get to the end of the 13th century, the last strip of territory in the Middle East that the Crusaders held has been lost to the Ayubid dynasty and then later Muslim dynasties, and it's been pretty clear that on military terms the Crusades have been a failure, that they have failed to conquer and maintain Christian control of the city of Jerusalem. So that's important to remember. However, many times when I see students confronted with the question whether Crusades a failure or a success, students only tend to focus on this aspect of it. And so it's important to remember that while the Crusades were a military failure, at the time they were also a spiritual success for a couple of reasons. The first of these is that the idea of the Crusade establishes a principle that discourages wars unless they are being fought for what at the time are considered noble or heroic reasons. Now, Today, some people might disagree with whether the Crusades were fought for noble or heroic reasons. But the fact remains that the idea of the Crusades and some of the ideas behind them certainly reduced the amount of violence in Europe at the time. And so the Crusades were successful in this way in improving the behavior of the warriors in medieval Europe. The Crusades are also successful in another way. Remember when the Crusades started, there was this huge competition about who was going to lead the medieval church. Was it going to be the Germanic emperors or was it going to be the popes? And the Crusades established the popes and established the papacy as the leader of medieval Europe, as the spiritual leader of medieval Europe. And this is really important because it establishes the success of the Abbey of Cluny, or this movement that goes back to the Abbey of Cluny, its goal for reforming the church. And that is that church and state are going to be separate, or church power and secular power are going to be separate. So instead of Europe developing into a theocratic state, where the political ruler is also the religious ruler, we're going to see really the origins of an unbroken trend of separation between church and state that date back from the time of the Crusades. So this is another way in which the Crusades are very important for the rise of the medieval and even later periods practice of Christianity and the relationship of Christianity with the state that we do still see reflected in modern society today.